There is a conversation that millions of men have never spoken out loud. It happens in silence, in the seconds before intimacy, a quiet interrogation that begins inside the mind, and the moment it starts, the body already knows something has gone wrong. If you have ever been in that moment, you do not need it described to you. You already know exactly what it feels like. And today, for the first time, we are going to talk about why it actually happens. Not with cliches, not with shame, and not with oversimplified advice. We're going to go inside the biology, inside the nervous system, inside the psychology of what is genuinely occurring, and why the solution has almost nothing to do with what most men are told to try first. Stay with this, because what we are about to cover changes the way you understand your own body entirely. Let us begin with the question almost no one thinks to ask. Not, why does this happen to me? But why does anxiety specifically shut down erections? What is the actual biological mechanism? Because once you understand it, everything else starts to make sense in a completely different way. The human nervous system operates in two broad modes. The first is a state of alertness, scanning for threat, preparing for action, redirecting resources toward survival. The second is a state of restoration, digestion, repair, recovery, and something researchers call rest and digest function. Sexual arousal lives entirely in that second state. It is a parasympathetic process. It can only occur when the brain does not believe the body is in danger. Here is what that means in practice. When anxiety enters the room, the brain activates its threat detection system. Blood is redirected to large muscle groups. The heart rate shifts. The mind becomes hypervigilant. And sexual arousal, which the nervous system classifies as completely non-essential to immediate survival, goes offline. This is not a malfunction. This is one of the most intelligent design features the human body has ever developed. The problem is that performance anxiety creates a threat that is entirely invisible. There is no physical danger. But the nervous system cannot distinguish between a genuine emergency and the quiet internal terror of worrying what a partner might think. To the brain, anxiety is anxiety. The physiological response is identical. And so the shutdown occurs, not because the body is broken, but because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Now here is where it gets more complex and more important. When a man experiences an erection difficulty for the first time, maybe he was tired, maybe he was stressed, maybe it was just one of those moments. Something else happens alongside it. The mind registers that moment as meaningful. It files it, labels it. And the next time intimacy approaches, that filed memory surfaces early. Sometimes hours before. Sometimes the moment the possibility enters the mind. Researchers in psychosexual medicine call this anticipatory anxiety. The body begins to fear the moment before the moment has even arrived. And the anxiety that was originally a response to difficulty becomes the cause of the next difficulty. A loop forms, self-reinforcing, quietly devastating. What makes this particularly difficult is how invisible it is from the outside. A man can appear completely calm to a partner, completely present in a conversation, completely fine in every other area of his life, and still carry this loop internally. Triggered the moment a certain kind of closeness begins. This is not weakness. This is a learned neurological pattern. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Here is a clinical reality that does not get nearly enough attention. Among younger and middle-aged men, the most common form of erectile difficulty is not physical. It is not arterial disease. It is not a hormonal imbalance. It does not show up on a blood test. The body is functioning. The nervous system is simply in the wrong gear. Researchers call this psychogenic erectile dysfunction. erection difficulties rooted in psychological rather than physical causes. And studies consistently suggest it represents the majority of cases in men under 50. This distinction is not just academic. It changes everything about what actually helps. Because here is what happens when a physical solution is applied to a psychological pattern. The medication works. The moment passes. But the anxiety does not go anywhere. It waits. And over time, for men who rely entirely on pharmaceutical assistance without ever addressing the underlying nervous system pattern, the psychological component often deepens. The body learns that it needs help. The confidence that should have been rebuilt never gets rebuilt. And the loop continues, just quieter. This is not an argument against medical intervention. There are absolutely contexts in which physical factors are involved and require professional attention. But for the vast majority of men whose experience is fundamentally anxiety-driven, the most important work happens in a different place entirely. So what does genuine change actually look like? The first shift, and this is foundational, everything else depends on it, is the internal story a man carries about his own body's responses. There is an enormous amount of cultural conditioning that tells men arousal should be automatic, instant, mechanical, that it should switch on the moment an external stimulus appears, regardless of stress, emotional context, or relational safety. The science does not support this, not even slightly. Research in sexology has consistently shown that male arousal is contextual. It is shaped by mood, by the quality of connection in the room, by stress load, by physical comfort, by dozens of subtle cues that most men have never been taught to pay attention to. A man who is exhausted, emotionally disconnected, or quietly carrying anxiety is physiologically less likely to experience strong arousal. Even when all the external conditions appear ideal. This is not failure. This is how the human body actually works. When a man truly internalizes this, not just intellectually agrees with it, but actually feels the truth of it in his body, something begins to loosen. The rigid self-evaluation softens. The body stops being treated as a machine that has malfunctioned and starts being understood as a sensitive, intelligent system that responds to conditions. And that shift in perception produces measurable physiological effects, because the way a person interprets a physical experience changes the physiological trajectory that follows. A man who notices reduced arousal and thinks, "Something is fundamentally broken in me," activates the exact stress response that guarantees further difficulty. A man who notices the same thing and thinks, "My body needs slightly different conditions right now," stays regulated and remains far more likely to naturally transition into arousal as the moment continues to unfold. This is not positive thinking. This is applied neuroscience. Now let us talk about the breath, because this is where most people expect a simple tip, and instead find something that runs much deeper than they anticipated. Slow, diaphragmatic breathing. Belly breathing, where the inhale expands the abdomen and the exhale is long and audible, directly activates the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the same branch required for sexual arousal. When a person breathes this way, the body receives a neurological signal. Heart rate decreases. Cortisol drops. The vigilance of the threat detection system begins to quiet. The breath is one of the only voluntary bridges between the conscious mind and the autonomic nervous system. It is one of the most direct ways a person can change their internal state without any external tool. And for men who experience anxiety before or during intimacy, conscious breathing is not a relaxation trick. It is a physiologically valid lever that alters the actual neurochemical environment of the moment. 5 to 10 slow breaths. Belly rising on the inhale. A long, audible sigh on the exhale. The sound matters. It sends the signal more effectively than a silent breath. Do it before intimacy. Do it during. Do it in the bathroom, at the dinner table, in the car on the way home. The nervous system does not care where you do it. It responds to the signal regardless. There is another dimension of this conversation that almost never gets addressed, and it may be the most practically useful insight in this entire video. Most men develop their relationship with sexual pleasure in a context that is very fast, very private, and almost entirely visual. Over years, the experience becomes extremely narrow, focused on one type of sensation, in one part of the body, disconnected from breath, from the rest of the physical self, from emotional presence. What this creates over time is a very limited map of pleasure. And when intimacy with another person introduces a completely different texture, slower, less predictable, emotionally layered, physically varied, many men discover they have no navigation for it. The body does not know how to follow that territory because it has only ever traveled one road. Research on sensory awareness and sexuality suggests that broadening a man's relationship with his own physical experience, learning to notice sensation across the whole body, not just in one place, fundamentally changes the experience of arousal. Not as a trick, but because it rebuilds the neurological connection between sensation, presence, and pleasure. When a man can stay present with what he is actually feeling, rather than escaping into his head to evaluate and monitor, the experience itself becomes what produces arousal. Naturally, without pressure, without management. This is a practice. It is developed gradually, but it changes the relationship with the body in ways that are genuinely lasting. Here is one of the most counterintuitive insights in human performance research, and it applies far beyond sexuality. In almost every domain where anxiety and performance intersect, athletics, public speaking, creative work, high-stakes decision-making, the attempt to force a specific outcome makes that outcome less likely. The cognitive load of needing to succeed directly interferes with the natural processes required for success. Psychologists call this ironic process theory. The harder you try not to think about something, the more present that thing becomes. The more you monitor a natural process to make sure it is happening correctly, the more you disrupt it. Applied to sexual experience, this means that a man who enters intimacy already scanning his body for early signs of difficulty, already watching, already monitoring, already bracing, is doing the exact thing that makes difficulty inevitable. The monitoring is the interference. The antidote is not trying harder. The antidote is deliberately reducing the psychological stakes of the experience, not because the experience does not matter, but because removing the pressure of a specific required outcome returns the nervous system to the state where natural response becomes possible again. In practice, this often begins with a conversation, a genuine one, before intimacy, not clinical, not heavy, not a declaration of a problem. Simply an honest, relaxed exchange with a partner that removes the unspoken contract of expected performance. That removes the goal of a specific outcome and replaces it with something more honest, just being present together in whatever way that unfolds. This kind of conversation requires courage, but the research on relational context and sexual function consistently shows that emotional safety between partners is one of the most significant predictors of natural arousal. The nervous system responds to safety, and safety, in intimate contexts, is built through honesty, not through performance. And then there is something that tends to get dismissed as too simple to be meaningful, but which carries genuine neurological weight: playfulness, humor, lightness, the ability to find warmth inside imperfection rather than treating it as evidence of failure. Laughter and genuine positive affect are physiologically incompatible with the threat state that produces performance anxiety. When two people can laugh in a moment of imperfection, when the pressure dissolves into something human and warm, the nervous system registers something profoundly different from failure. It registers safety. And safety is the exact internal condition under which natural arousal becomes possible. This is not a soft suggestion. This is neurochemistry. The men who report the most meaningful and lasting shifts in this area are not the ones who found a technique that mechanically produced a result. They are the ones who changed their relationship with the experience itself, who stopped treating their body as something to be controlled or corrected, and started treating it as something to be understood, supported, and given the right conditions to respond naturally. This is a fundamentally different relationship with the body than most of us are taught to have. We are taught to push, to override, to optimize, to produce. We are rarely taught to slow down, listen, and respond to what we are actually feeling, rather than what we think we should be feeling. And the nervous system, it turns out, is extraordinarily responsive to this kind of attention. Patterns that have been reinforced over years can be gradually and genuinely shifted through consistent new experiences. Different ways of breathing, different ways of relating to the body, different ways of approaching intimacy with less evaluation and more presence. The brain adapts. The stories we carry about ourselves are not permanent. There is one more layer here that tends to remain invisible in almost every conversation on this topic, and it deserves to be named directly. The vulnerability of sexual experience is real for men, emotionally, not just physically. There is a particular exposure in intimacy that cultural narratives rarely give men permission to acknowledge. And when that vulnerability becomes attached to shame, when a man begins to carry the quiet belief that his worth as a partner, or even as a person, is somehow contingent on a physical response, that weight becomes its own barrier. Separate from the anxiety, deeper than the anxiety. Addressing that honestly, with a partner, with a professional if appropriate, or even in one's own internal conversation, is often as important as anything else in this picture. The body tends to respond to being understood. It tends to open when it is given permission to be imperfect. And it tends to find its natural rhythm when the mind is willing to release the grip of evaluation long enough for real experience to occur. None of what we have covered today is a prescription. It is not medical advice. For anyone with persistent concerns, speaking with a qualified healthcare professional is always the appropriate and worthwhile step. Physical health, cardiovascular function, sleep quality, metabolic health, stress load, all have documented relationships with sexual well-being, and those dimensions deserve attention too. But for the very large number of men whose experience is fundamentally driven by anxiety and psychological pattern, whose body is capable, but whose nervous system has learned to preempt the moment, the most important insight is this: the body was never the problem. The loop was. The story was. The pressure was. The monitoring was. And all of those things, unlike a physical condition, respond directly to understanding, to patience, and to a willingness to approach the experience differently. Here is what we know from the most current research in psychosexual health. The men who find genuine resolution, not a workaround, not a suppression, but actual, lasting change, are not the ones who overpowered their anxiety. They are the ones who stopped fighting themselves long enough to hear what their body was actually trying to say. And what it was saying, almost always, wasn't failure. It was a need for more safety, for more presence, for less pressure, for an experience of intimacy that felt like genuine connection rather than a test with a pass or fail result. When that is truly understood, felt in the body, not just accepted in the mind, something shifts. Quietly, gradually, but genuinely. Not because a switch was flipped, but because a relationship was healed. Between mind and body. Between expectation and experience. Between who a man believes he is supposed to be in intimate moments and who he actually is. With all the complexity, sensitivity, and depth that comes with being fully human. Your body has been communicating with you this entire time. The only question is whether you have been willing to listen.